My name is Eleanor Gray, and for over 40 years, I was a hospice nurse, sitting with the dying, praying for their peace, and clinging to my faith as my anchor. I thought I knew what awaited us after death: heaven, judgment, salvation. But everything changed the day I died. In those moments between life and eternity, I crossed into a place so beautiful and terrifying that it shattered everything I thought I understood about God, sin, and grace. What I saw on that bridge didn't just change my faith, it saved my soul. The day started like any other, though I should have known better than to call it ordinary. My mornings were usually spent at the hospice, tending to patients who were staring down the inevitable. People always thought my job must be grim, but I saw it as a calling. My faith was my compass, guiding me to bring comfort to those on the brink of eternity. I'd seen death more times than I could count, but that day shook me to my core. It began with Mr. Hargrove, a man whose illness had withered him to skin and bone. He wasn't one of my believers, as he liked to call us. He dismissed my offers to pray with him, his one strong voice rasping out, "God's not gonna help me now." I didn't push, I never pushed, but I still prayed for him in my heart. That morning, his breathing grew shallow, the gurgle of death creeping closer. I sat by his side, holding his hand, reciting Psalm 23 under my breath. His eyes fluttered open, locking onto mine with a desperation I hadn't seen before. "Do you think he's really there?" he whispered. His voice was so faint I leaned in to catch the words. "Yes," I said firmly, squeezing his hand. "He's waiting for you with open arms." Tears streamed down his cheeks, and I thought for a moment I'd reached him. But his lips trembled as he said, "You don't know what's waiting out there." His body seized, and he was gone before I could respond. His face froze in an expression of terror that left me cold. I left the room shaken. For all my years in hospice, for all the deaths I'd witnessed, I'd never been haunted by a patient's final words like that. As I drove home, the echo of Mr. Hargrove's fear lingered in my mind. The setting sun painted the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, but I barely noticed. I was too busy replaying his words, questioning if I'd failed him somehow. That's when it happened. I don't remember much about the crash itself. One moment I was driving, and the next, a sharp pain lanced through my head as the world spun. I heard the screech of tires, felt the jarring impact of metal crumpling around me. My chest constricted like a vice, and I gasped for air, the sound of sirens growing louder in the distance. I remember thinking, is this it? Is this how I go? Then the world went dark. When I woke, it wasn't in the hospital. It wasn't anywhere I recognized. I was standing, though I didn't remember getting up, and the world around me was impossibly still. A soft, glowing light surrounded me, so warm it felt like stepping into a summer morning. But the light wasn't coming from the sun or the sky. It was emanating from a massive bridge stretching endlessly in both directions. The bridge wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. It shimmered and shifted, as though made of threads of pure light woven together with strands of shadow. Each step glowed beneath my feet, yet the spaces around the bridge felt ominously dark. I felt a pull toward the far side, where the light grew brighter and figures stood in the distance, watching. They seemed familiar somehow, though I couldn't place why. I took a tentative step forward, but a voice stopped me. "Not so fast, Eleanor." I turned to see a figure emerging from the edge of the bridge. It wasn't a man or a woman. It was light and shadow given form, both solid and fluid, impossible to define. It radiated a presence that stilled my fear and left me breathless. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I am the guardian," it said. Its voice was neither harsh nor kind, simply steady. "This is the bridge of unseen light. All souls pass this way, but your journey is not yet over." I didn't understand what it meant, but before I could ask, the guardian waved a hand. Orbs of light appeared, floating around me like fireflies. As they drew closer, they expanded, each one revealing a fragment of my life. I saw myself as a young girl, kneeling by my bed in prayer. I saw the day I got married, my husband's face radiant with joy. I saw the patients I'd cared for, the families I'd comforted, the countless prayers I'd whispered over the dying. At first, I felt a swell of pride. I'd lived a life of service, hadn't I? I'd done what God asked of me. But then the orbs changed. The scenes turned darker, sharper. I saw moments I wanted to forget, times when I judged others harshly, moments of anger I'd buried, and the hurtful things I'd said to my son when he walked away from the church. You were quick to comfort others, the guardian said, its voice calm but piercing, but slow to forgive. You held others to a standard you didn't hold yourself to. The words hit me like a blow. I tried to defend myself, but no words came. Instead, more orbs appeared, showing the faces of people I'd failed, people like Mr. Hargrove, whose fear I couldn't ease. The bridge seemed to grow dimmer, the light above me fading into shadows. I don't understand, I whispered. I tried to live by God's word. I tried to help. The guardian tilted its head, studying me. Did you live by faith or by fear? Did you comfort them for their sake or for your own? The questions burned. I wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that I'd done my best, but deep down, I knew there was truth in its words. I had clung to my faith not just out of love for God, but out of fear, fear of what lay beyond, fear of being found wanting. The darkness around the bridge grew heavier, and I felt the abyss beneath me begin to call. It wasn't a voice, exactly, but a presence, cold and accusing. I teetered on the edge, unsure if I had the strength to go forward. And then, in the distance, I saw them, the figures at the far end of the bridge. They seemed to glow with a light I couldn't describe, their presence both inviting and intimidating. Something told me they held the answers I sought, but to reach them, I would have to face everything I feared. I turned back to the guardian. What do I do now? I asked, my voice barely audible. Walk, it said simply. But the truth lies in the journey, not the destination. I swallowed hard, my legs trembling as I took another step forward, the darkness below me whispering its threats. Whatever lay ahead, I knew I couldn't turn back. Not now. Not ever. With each step I took on the bridge, the light and shadows seemed to swirl closer together, as though the path itself was alive. The figures in the distance didn't grow nearer, but their presence grew stronger. I could feel their gaze, not judgmental, but probing, as if they could see every corner of my soul. I wanted to run to them, to beg for answers, but the bridge demanded slow, deliberate steps. Each one felt heavier than the last, as if I were carrying the weight of every moment I'd ever lived. The orbs returned, glowing softly around me. Their light felt different this time, not warm and nostalgic, but piercing. They hung low, surrounding me in a circle, and one by one, they revealed scenes from my life. This time, they weren't the memories I wanted to see. I saw myself standing in the kitchen years ago, arguing with my son, David. He was barely 20, his face young and defiant, his voice trembling with a kind of anger that hides pain. I don't believe in it, Mom, he had said. I don't believe in any of it. God, the church, heaven, it's not real to me. I remembered the cold, hard anger that had surged through me in that moment. After everything I taught you, after all I've done for you, I'd snapped. If you walk away from God, you're walking away from me. The memory hit me like a blow to the chest. I saw the look in his eyes, shock, hurt, and then the hardening as he turned and walked out the door. I hadn't seen him for years after that. My pride, my faith, my certainty, they'd all built a wall between us that neither of us could scale. Stop, I whispered, trying to turn away from the memory, but the orbs didn't obey. Another floated closer, casting a new scene. This time, I was at the bedside of a patient named Mrs. Turner. She'd been a sweet woman, devout in her faith, but the cancer had eaten away at her until she barely recognized herself. In her last hours, she'd confessed to me that she was terrified, not of dying, but of facing God. What if I didn't do enough? She had wept. I'd held her hand, quoting scripture to soothe her, but I remembered the doubt that had crept into my own heart in that moment. I'd wondered the same thing about myself. What if I hadn't done enough? What if all my faith and service weren't enough to secure my place in heaven? I'd buried the fear, masking it with platitudes, but now it returned with a vengeance. The guardian appeared beside me, its form glowing faintly. "You see now," it said, its voice calm and unyielding. "You have lived with one foot in fear and one in faith. But fear cannot cross this bridge." I turned to it, desperation rising in my chest. "I've tried," I said, my voice cracking. "I've tried to do what's right, to follow God's word. Isn't that enough?" The guardian tilted its head slightly, as though considering me. "Your actions were guided by faith, but your heart was chained by fear. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. You comforted others, but never truly accepted comfort for yourself. You offered forgiveness, but withheld it where it mattered most." The words stung, and I wanted to argue, but deep down, I knew they were true. My heart clenched as I thought of David again. I had prayed for him every day since he left, but I had never once reached out to him. I had convinced myself that I was waiting for him to come back to me, but now I saw the truth. I'd been too proud to meet him halfway. The bridge shifted beneath me, the light flickering, and for a moment, I thought I might fall. I glanced down at the abyss below, and that was when I saw it. A figure began to rise from the shadows, dark and shapeless at first, but then it took on a form I recognized. It was me, a younger version of me, dressed in the scrubs I'd worn in my early days as a nurse, her face stern and unyielding. "You were always so sure of yourself," the figure said, its voice a perfect mirror of my own. "So certain you were right. But were you? Were you really?" I took a step back, my pulse quickening. "I did the best I could," I said, my voice trembling. "I followed God's word. I cared for others. I You cared for others because it made you feel righteous," the figure interrupted, stepping closer. "Because it made you feel safe. But when it mattered most, you couldn't even forgive your own son." The words pierced through me, and I felt the tears welling in my eyes. I didn't know how, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. I was afraid that forgiving him meant letting go of what I believed in. "And now," the figure asked, its gaze locking onto mine, "do you still believe that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The weight of my failures pressed down on me, and for a moment, I felt myself slipping, the abyss below calling to me. The darkness whispered of every mistake I'd ever made, every moment of doubt, every failure to live up to the faith I claimed to follow. But then, a voice broke through the darkness, not the guardian's, but one from deep within me. It was quiet and small, but it carried a strength that surprised me. "Grace," it said. "Grace is not earned. It is given." I clung to the word like a lifeline, repeating it to myself as I took another step forward. The light of the bridge grew steadier, pushing back the shadows, and I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift. The guardian watched silently, its presence steady and unmoving, as I took another step and then another. The orbs around me faded, their lessons etched into my heart, and the figure of my younger self dissolved into the light. The path ahead still seemed endless, the figures in the distance still too far to reach, but for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't turn back now. I had to keep moving forward. The air on the bridge grew colder as I pressed forward, each step a battle against the whispers of doubt that still lingered in my mind. The light ahead seemed further than ever, and though I knew I couldn't turn back, I questioned if I had the strength to keep going. The guardian walked beside me, silent but steady, its presence a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone. Yet, even its light seemed dimmer now, as if it, too, waited to see if I would falter. Then I felt it, a shift beneath my feet. The bridge trembled, the light flickering as though a storm brewed deep within it. I froze, gripping the edges of the path as a voice rose from the darkness below, low and venomous. It wasn't the whispers of the shadows this time. This voice was clear, sharp, and chillingly familiar. "So, this is the faithful servant," it drawled, dripping with mockery. "The nurse, the caregiver, the believer." I looked down, And from the abyss, a new figure emerged. It was taller than the shadow of my younger self had been, its form shifting between darkness and flame. Its eyes glowed a piercing crimson, and its grin was too wide, too knowing. My breath caught as I realized who or what I was facing. Lucifer, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure bowed mockingly. At your service, it said, its grin widening. Though service is hardly my nature. Wouldn't you agree? I stepped back instinctively, clutching my chest as my heart raced. The guardian stood firm beside me, silent and unmoving, but I could feel its presence like a shield. Lucifer's gaze flicked to it briefly before returning to me, amusement dancing in its eyes. The guardian, it said, its tone laced with disdain. Ever the watcher, never the doer. And here you are, Eleanor, trudging along this bridge as if you'll find some great reward at the end. Tell me, do you really believe you're worthy of what lies ahead? I wanted to answer, but the words stuck in my throat. Did I believe it? After everything I'd seen, everything I'd been shown about myself, the answer wasn't as clear as I wanted it to be. My hesitation seemed to delight Lucifer, who laughed, a sound like the crackling of fire and the shattering of glass. You don't, do you? It said, circling me slowly. You doubt. You fear. You question. And why shouldn't you? After all, you've seen the truth about yourself. The harsh, ugly truth. I turned to the guardian, desperate for it to speak, to offer me some reassurance, but it remained silent. Its gaze was fixed on me, expectant, as though waiting for me to find my own answer. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, and turned back to Lucifer. I know I've made mistakes, I said, my voice trembling but firm. I know I've fallen short, but I've tried to live with faith. I've tried to follow God's will. Lucifer's grin widened. Faith? God's will? Oh, Eleanor, you really think that's enough? That the scraps of service you've offered will earn you a place in heaven? Let me tell you a secret. It leaned closer, its voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. There's no place for people like you up there. Heaven is for the spotless, the blameless, the perfect. Do you really think you belong? Its words pierced through me like daggers, each one tearing at the fragile hope I'd been clinging to. I felt tears welling in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Grace, I said, my voice cracking. God's grace is enough. Lucifer's laugh was louder this time, echoing around the bridge like thunder. Grace, it said mockingly. Such a lovely word, isn't it? But tell me this, Eleanor. Did you show grace to your son? To yourself? Or were you too busy hiding behind your faith, using it as a shield against the world you couldn't face? I flinched at its words, my heart aching with the weight of their truth. But then, a flicker of light caught my eye. It wasn't from the bridge or the guardian. It was coming from within me. It was small, barely visible, but it was there. I've failed, I said, my voice trembling. I've fallen short. But grace isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to try again. It's about forgiveness, even when it's hard, even when it's myself I have to forgive. Lucifer's grin faltered, and for a moment, its eyes narrowed. The flicker of light within me grew brighter, steadying as I spoke. I don't have all the answers, I continued, but I know this. God's grace isn't something I can earn. It's something I have to accept. And I do. I accept it. The bridge steadied beneath my feet, the light growing stronger, pushing back the shadows. Lucifer hissed, its form flickering as the light reached it. This isn't over, Eleanor. It spat, retreating into the darkness. You'll face me again. You'll face yourself again. As it disappeared, the guardian stepped forward, its light enveloping me like a warm embrace. Well done, it said simply, its voice filled with quiet pride. I let out a shaky breath, my legs trembling beneath me. The path ahead seemed clearer now, the figures in the distance more distinct. They were still far away, but I felt their presence like a beacon, guiding me forward. The guardian gestured for me to continue. Your journey is not complete, it said, but you've taken the first step toward understanding. I nodded, my heart still racing but steadier now. The flicker of light within me hadn't disappeared. It was still there, growing stronger with every breath. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. With the guardian by my side and the light within me as my guide, I stepped forward, leaving the shadows behind. The air shifted as I continued across the bridge, the light ahead no longer just a distant promise, but something more tangible, more real. Each step felt lighter now, as though shedding the weight of the shadows had freed me to walk with a clearer purpose. Yet, with every step, the figures at the far end became clearer, and their silent observation felt heavier than any burden I had carried before. I wasn't afraid of them, but I was painfully aware of how much I had yet to understand. The bridge stretched ahead, impossibly vast, and I realized that it was not the same path for everyone. It twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, spiraling off into directions I couldn't follow, like threads of a tapestry unraveling into infinity. I could see glimpses of others walking their own paths, each moving toward their own light, their own truths. Some stumbled, faltering as the shadows clung to them, while others surged forward, propelled by a strength I couldn't yet comprehend. I wanted to reach out to them, to help, but the guardian's presence beside me reminded me that this was a journey I had to complete on my own. As I walked, the light ahead began to change. It was no longer a single, blinding radiance, but a spectrum of colors, shifting and flowing like a living river. I could see forms within it, indistinct yet unmistakably alive. My heart quickened as I realized what I was seeing, heaven, or at least the edge of it. It was more beautiful than anything I could have imagined, a place where every color, every sound, every sensation seemed to sing with the essence of love and peace. I wanted to run to it, to throw myself into its embrace, but something held me back. A single orb of light appeared before me, glowing brighter than any I had seen before. I hesitated, knowing what it meant. Another memory, another truth I had to face. The guardian remained silent, its form a steady presence at my side, but I could feel its attention on me, waiting to see how I would respond. With a deep breath, I reached out, and the orb expanded, surrounding me in its glow. I was back in my living room years ago, sitting across from my husband, Robert. His face was lined with exhaustion, his hands clasped tightly together as he spoke. "Eleanor," he had said, his voice heavy with emotion, "you have to let it go. David's not coming back if you keep shutting him out." My chest tightened as I remembered my response. "He's the one who walked away," I had said sharply. "He turned his back on us, on God. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter." Robert's eyes had filled with a sadness that broke me even now. "It matters, yes," he had said quietly, "but so does forgiveness. So does love. If you can't forgive him, how can you expect God to forgive you?" The memory faded, leaving me trembling on the bridge. I had dismissed Robert's words back then, clinging to my anger like a shield, but now they cut through me with a clarity I couldn't deny. I had used my faith as a weapon, not a refuge, and in doing so, I had driven away the very people I was meant to love. "You see now," the guardian said, its voice gentle but firm. "Forgiveness is not just for others, it is for yourself. To hold on to anger, even in the name of righteousness, is to chain your own soul." Tears streamed down my face as I nodded, the truth sinking into me like sunlight after a storm. I had spent so much in my life trying to be perfect, to live up to the standards I thought God demanded, but in doing so, I had missed the point entirely. Grace wasn't about perfection, it was about love. It was about choosing compassion over pride, humility over judgment. The orb dissolved, its light merging with the bridge, and I felt the weight lift from my chest. I could still feel the ache of my mistakes, but it was no longer crushing. It was a part of me, yes, but it didn't define me. I took a step forward, then another, the light ahead growing brighter with each one. And then I saw them. The figures at the end of the bridge were no longer distant shadows, but fully formed beings, their presence radiating a warmth that filled me with both awe and longing. Some of them I recognized: my mother, my grandmother, even Robert, his face younger and freer than I had ever seen it in life. They stood together, their hands outstretched as if beckoning me forward. But there were others, too, figures I didn't know, but felt inexplicably connected to. They weren't just people, they were parts of something greater, threads in the same tapestry that wove me into existence. I wanted to run to them, to throw myself into their arms, but the guardian stopped me with a raised hand. "Not yet," it said, its voice gentle but firm. "You are not ready." I turned to it, confusion and desperation warring within me. "But they're right there," I said, my voice breaking. "Why can't I go to them?" The guardian's light dimmed slightly, its form flickering as though reflecting my own uncertainty. "You have seen much," it said, "but there is still more to understand. Your journey is not just for you, it is for those you left behind." The word struck me like a blow, and I realized what it meant. I couldn't stay, not yet. There was still work to be done, still people who needed me. My son's face flashed in my mind, and I felt a surge of determination. I had spent so long waiting for him to come back to me, but now I understood. It was my turn to go to him. The figures at the end of the bridge smiled, their light filling me with a warmth that chased away the last remnants of doubt. They weren't saying goodbye, they were saying, "We'll be here when you're ready." I turned back to the Guardian, my heart steadier than it had been in years. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice calm despite the storm of emotions within me. The Guardian stepped aside, its light growing brighter. "Now," it said, "you return. And when the time comes, you will cross this bridge again. Not in fear, but in peace." I took one last look at the figures at the end of the bridge, their light filling me with a strength I hadn't known I possessed. Then I turned and stepped into the glow, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The first thing I felt was the heaviness. My chest ached as if I'd been carrying a mountain, and my limbs refused to obey me. Sounds filtered in, muffled voices, the steady beep of a machine, and the faint hum of something mechanical. It took me a moment to understand what was happening. I was back. I opened my eyes slowly, squinting against the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital room. Everything felt wrong, disconnected, as though I wasn't fully in my body yet. My fingers twitched weakly at my side, and I heard someone gasp. "She's awake," a voice said, trembling with emotion. It took a moment for my vision to clear, but when it did, I saw him. David, my son. He stood at the edge of the bed, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mix of relief and disbelief. His hair was streaked with gray I didn't remember, and lines of worry etched his once youthful face. How long had it been since I'd seen him? How long had I waited for this moment? "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. He moved closer, hesitating as though afraid to touch me. "You're okay." I wanted to respond, to tell him how much I loved him, how sorry I was, but my throat felt like sandpaper, and all I could manage was a croak. Tears filled his eyes as he reached for my hand, holding it gently as though I might break. His touch grounded me, pulling me fully back into the world, and I felt my own tears slip down my cheeks. "You scared us," he said, his grip tightening slightly. "The doctor said it was a stroke. They weren't sure if you'd wake up." I blinked slowly, the weight of his words settling over me. A stroke. The crash. It all came flooding back. The pain, the darkness, the bridge. My heart raced as I remembered the light, the guardian, and the figures waiting for me at the end. It hadn't been a dream. It was real. And now I was here, back in this broken, beautiful world, with a second chance I hadn't earned, but had been given nonetheless. David's voice broke through my thoughts. I didn't know if I should come," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "After everything that happened, I thought you wouldn't want to see me." His words sliced through me, and I felt the sharp sting of regret all over again. I had built that wall between us, brick by brick, with my pride and my stubbornness. But I wasn't that person anymore. I couldn't be. "David," I rasped, my voice barely audible. He looked up, his eyes wide with hope and fear. I swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "I'm so sorry." his brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. Mom, you don't have to. Yes, I do. I interrupted, my voice hoarse but steady. I was wrong about so many things. I let my pride and my anger get in the way of loving you the way I should have. I let it push you away, and I'm sorry. His grip on my hand tightened, and he shook his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. No, Mom. I left. I was the one who walked away. I. We both made mistakes, I said, cutting him off gently. But none of that matters now. What matters is that you're here. And I love you, David. I've always loved you. The dam broke then. He sobbed openly, collapsing into the chair beside my bed and burying his face in his hands. I reached out with my free hand, weak as I was, and rested it on his head, running my fingers through his hair like I had when he was a boy. It felt like a lifetime's worth of tension and grief melted away in that moment, leaving only love behind. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, the world around us fading into the background. When he finally sat up, his face was blotchy and red, but his eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in years. He smiled, and for the first time, I saw the boy he used to be, the one I'd lost but had never stopped loving. Mom, he said softly, there's so much I want to say. So much I want to tell you. I nodded, squeezing his hand. We'll have time, I said, my voice still rough but steadier now. We'll make time. In the days that followed, David rarely left my side. He told me about his life, the struggles he'd faced, and the ways he had tried to make peace with the choices he'd made. I listened, my heart breaking and mending all at once as I realized how much I had missed. He wasn't the angry, defiant boy I had clung to in my memory. He was a man, flawed and beautiful, just like me. As I regained my strength, I began to share my own story, not just the memories of our fractured past, but the journey I had taken on the bridge. I told him about the guardian, the light, and the truths I had been forced to face. I told him about the figures at the end of the bridge, the way they had shown me what forgiveness and grace truly meant. At first, he listened in silence, his expression unreadable. But as I spoke, I saw something shift in his eyes. He didn't dismiss my words or question my sanity. Instead, he seemed to understand in a way I hadn't expected. Do you think, he asked one night, his voice hesitant, that what you saw, do you think it means there's hope for all of us? Even for someone like me? I reached for his hand, holding it tightly. Yes, I said firmly. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that grace is for everyone. It's never too late, David. Never. His eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of hope. He smiled, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know how much time I had left or what the future would hold. But I knew this. I had been given a gift, a second chance to love and forgive and live fully. And I wasn't going to waste it. The days after I woke up were a strange blur of sensations and emotions, each one louder and sharper than the last. My body was weak, tethered to the machines that monitored my every heartbeat, but my spirit felt stronger than it ever had. I couldn't stop replaying what I'd experienced on the bridge, the light, the guardian, the figures waiting for me. It was all as vivid as if I'd just stepped off that shimmering path, but now I was back, thrust into a world that felt both familiar and foreign. David was there, sitting by my bedside as often as the nurses would let him. I could see the guilt and hesitation in his eyes, but I also saw something else. Hope. He didn't know how to bridge the years between us, and neither did I, but the fact that he was there at all was enough to start. We didn't have to say much at first. Sometimes, it was enough just to hold his hand and let the silence stretch between us. Words would come when they needed to. As my strength returned, so did the flood of memories and regrets. I couldn't stop thinking about the life I lived before my near-death experience. All the mistakes I'd made, the grudges I'd clung to, the love I'd withheld. It was almost unbearable to look at my son and realize how many years I had lost, how many moments I had let slip away because of my pride and stubbornness. But I also understood now that those moments didn't have to define what came next. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the hospital window, I decided it was time to tell him the truth. He was sitting in the chair beside me, flipping through a magazine he wasn't really reading, his foot tapping nervously against the floor. I reached out and touched his arm, and he looked up, startled. David, I said softly, I need to tell you something. Something important. He set the magazine aside and leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern. What is it, Mom? I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. How do you explain something like this? How do you tell someone about standing at the edge of eternity and being given a second chance? When I was unconscious, I experienced something. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt more real than anything I've ever known. He didn't speak, but his eyes were fixed on mine, full of curiosity and unease. I pressed on, my voice trembling. I was somewhere else. There was a bridge made of light, and I walked on it. There was a guardian, a being of light and shadow, who showed me my life, everything I'd done, good and bad. And at the end of the bridge, there were people waiting for me, people I've loved and lost. David's face softened, his tension easing just a bit. People like Dad? He asked quietly. I nodded, tears springing to my eyes. Yes, your father was there. He looked so free, so full of joy. And there were others too. My mother, my grandmother, even people I didn't know, but somehow felt connected to. They were all waiting for me. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. And what did they say? They didn't speak, I admitted, but they didn't need to. Their presence said everything. They were waiting, but they also understood that it wasn't my time. The guardian told me I had to come back, that there were things I still needed to do. David stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I braced myself for skepticism or disbelief, but when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost reverent. What do you think it means? Why do you think you were sent back? The question lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. I thought about it, really thought about it before answering. I think, I think it was to make things right. I said slowly. To let go of the anger and fear that have held me back for so long. To forgive and to love and to truly live in the grace I've always claimed to believe in. His eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and he nodded. Do you think it's possible? After everything that's happened between us? I reached for his hand, holding it tightly. I know it is, I said, my voice steady. We've been given this chance, David. We can't waste it. The days that followed were filled with conversations we should have had years ago. David told me about his struggles, how he had felt rejected not just by me, but by the faith I had clung to so tightly. He told me about the ways he had tried to fill the void and the ways he had failed. It broke my heart to hear how much pain he had carried, but it also gave me hope. He was here, sharing it with me, and that meant we could start to heal. In turn, I shared my own regrets and fears. I told him about the pride that had blinded me, the anger that had consumed me. I told him about the bridge, about how I had seen my own flaws and failures laid bare, and how it had forced me to confront the truth about myself. I told him about the light, the forgiveness I had been shown, and the love that had been waiting for me all along. I think, I said one evening, as we sat together watching the sun set outside the hospital window, that grace is the most powerful thing in the world. It's not something we can earn or deserve. It's a gift freely given, and all we have to do is accept it. David nodded, his gaze distant but thoughtful. Do you think there's still hope for me? He asked quietly. I turned to him, my heart breaking at the vulnerability in his voice. There's always hope, I said firmly. It's never too late, David. Not for you, not for me, not for anyone. He smiled then, a small, tentative smile, but it was enough. It was a beginning. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew this. We had been given a gift, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. And I wasn't going to waste it. Neither of us would. In the weeks that followed my return home, life felt different in ways I couldn't fully explain. Everything seemed sharper, more vivid. The smell of coffee brewing in the morning, the warmth of sunlight streaming through the curtains, even the sound of rain tapping against the window. It was as though I had been blind to the beauty of the world before, rushing through each day without truly seeing it. Now, every moment felt like a gift. David visited often, far more than I'd expected. At first, he was hesitant, as though waiting for the old walls to rise back up between us. But they didn't. I wouldn't let them. Each time he walked through the door, I welcomed him with open arms, and slowly, the tension began to fade. We talked about everything: his life, my regrets, the things we'd both been too afraid to say before. The chasm that had separated us for so many years began to close, inch by inch, until it felt as though it had never existed at all. One day, as we sat together on the porch, I noticed David looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He had brought me a cup of tea, and he lingered, holding his own mug but not drinking from it. "What is it?" I asked, watching him closely. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair before meeting my gaze. "I've been thinking about what you told me," he said, his voice quiet. "About the bridge. About the Guardian." I nodded, setting my tea aside. "What about it?" He sighed, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. Do you think it's true for everyone? That there's a place for all of us, even after everything we've done wrong?" His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. I reached out and placed a hand on his arm, squeezing gently. "Yes," I said firmly. "I believe that with all my heart. The light I saw, the love I felt, it wasn't just for me. It's for everyone. You, me, everyone who's willing to accept it." He nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing just a little. "I want to believe that," he said, "but it's hard. I've spent so long feeling like I didn't belong, like I wasn't enough." I leaned closer, catching his eye. "David, none of us are enough on our own. That's the point of grace. It's not about what we've done or what we deserve. It's about what's given to us, freely and unconditionally. You don't have to earn it. You just have to accept it." For a long moment, he was silent, staring out at the horizon as though searching for something he couldn't quite name. Finally, he looked back at me, and I saw a spark of something new in his eyes. Hope. "Maybe I'll get there," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Someday." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "That's all anyone can do," I said. "Take it one step at a time." As the days turned into weeks, I found myself drawn to writing again, something I hadn't done in years. It started as a way to process everything I had experienced: the bridge, the guardian, the truths I had faced. But as I wrote, I realized that it wasn't just for me. There was a message in my story, one that I felt compelled to share. I didn't know if anyone would listen, but that didn't matter. The act of putting it into words, of reaching out to others, felt like a part of the work I was meant to do. I filled page after page with memories and reflections, weaving together the threads of my life with the lessons I had learned on the bridge. I wrote about the power of forgiveness, the beauty of grace, and the importance of letting go of fear. I wrote about David, about our fractured relationship and the slow, beautiful process of healing it. And I wrote about love, the kind of love that transcends everything, even death. One evening, as I sat at my desk, surrounded by the faint hum of the lamp and the quiet of the house, David knocked on the door. He had stopped by after work, as he often did, bringing takeout and a tired smile. But tonight he seemed different, lighter somehow. "Mom," he said, setting the bags down on the counter, "there's something I want to do. Something I've been thinking about since everything happened." I turned to him, curious. "What is it?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I want to go back to church, just to see. I don't know if I'm ready to believe again, but I feel like I need to try." My heart swelled, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I didn't want to push him or overwhelm him, so I simply nodded. "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said softly. "And if you want, I'd love to go with you." His smile was small but genuine, and he nodded. "I'd like that," he said. The following Sunday, We walked into the small church where I had spent so many years of my life. It felt both familiar and new, like returning to a home that had been waiting for me all along. The service was simple, filled with hymns and prayers that I had recited countless times before. But this time, they felt different, less like rituals and more like lifelines. As I sat beside David, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from having all the answers or knowing what the future holds. It was the peace of knowing that I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. When the service ended, David turned to me, his eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." I reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Thank you," I said, "for coming back." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the bridge, about the figures waiting for me at the end. I knew I wasn't ready to cross it yet, not for a long time, if I could help it. But when the time came, I wouldn't fear it. I would walk forward with love in my heart, knowing that I had done my best to make the most of the time I'd been given. And when I reached the other side, I knew they would be there, waiting for me. All of them, smiling, welcoming, and filled with the kind of love that never fades. Until then, I would carry that light with me, one step at a time, for as long as I could.